U.S. Supreme Court stated, the First Amendment has erected a wall of separation between church and state. That wall must be kept high and impregnable. This was a new philosophy for the court. Why would the court take Jefferson's letter completely out of context and cite only 8 of its words? Dr. William James, the father of modern psychology, and a strong opponent of religious principles in government and education, perhaps explained the court's new strategy when he stated, his statement precisely describes the tact utilized by the court in the years following its 1947 announcement. The court began regularly to speak of the separation of church and state, broadly explaining that, this is what the founders wanted, separation of church and state. This is their great intent. The court failed to quote the founders, it just generically asserted that this is what the founders wanted. The court continued to talk about separation until June 25, 1962, when, in the case Engel v. Vitale, the court delivered its first ever ruling which completely separated Christian principles from education. The case struck down school prayer. In that 1962 case, the court redefined the meaning and application of a single word, the word church. For 170 years prior to that case, the word church, as used in the phrase separation of church and state, was defined to mean a federally established denomination. However, in 1962 the court explained that the word church would now mean a religious activity in public. This was the turning point in the interpretation of the First Amendment.
In 1962, redefining what church and separation of church and state means. Before it meant a federal federally established denomination. But then the courts redefined it and said it will now mean religious activities in the public. And this is the turning point of the reinterpreting of the Constitution. And I might point out, the ruling is in contradiction, in conflict with the previous rulings. So in fact, this belief, this new redefinition of separation of church and state, religious activity in the public, is unconstitutional. And successive courts before that would agree and ruled in opposite with this new turning point of the redefinition of what church and state means. Separation of church and state means establishing a federally established denomination. The Church of England has a federal established denomination. Our founding fathers didn't want that, but they still wanted Christian principles and so forth in our society, in our community, in our public, and so forth. So I don't care what the modern day court rulings say concerning this subject. The rulings are in conflict and contradict the previous rulings of the Supreme Court and even what the founding fathers had intention in their minds when they formed and the conception of our Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, this great republic which we live under.
A turning point in the interpretation of the First Amendment. Understand what the court had just announced. No longer would the First Amendment simply prohibit the establishment of a federal denomination. It now would prohibit religious activities in public settings. This current doctrine of separation is a brand new doctrine. It is not something from the Founding Fathers, and it is not in any founding document. School prayer was the first casualty of the redefinition of the First Amendment in 1962. School prayer had never before been challenged, for school prayer had never established a national denomination and therefore had always been acceptable. But under the new definition, school prayer definitely was a religious activity in public and was therefore now deemed to be unconstitutional. Hat 1962 case, which first redefined the First Amendment and then removed school prayer, was notable in a number of aspects. Recall that the 1892 Supreme Court case offered 87 precedents to maintain the inclusion of Christian principles in our laws and institutions. This 1962 case, which removed school prayer, was just the opposite. It was the first case in court history to use no precedents. The court quoted 0 previous legal cases. Without any historical or legal base, the court simply made an announcement: we'll not have prayers in schools anymore. That violates the Constitution. A brand new direction was taken in America.
So what's going? So redefining definition. Who's right? Well, clearly, the Founding Fathers are right. Clearly, their intention was not to have separation of religious principles in the public from the state. They wanted separation from church and state, a federally established denomination, separation from that. This redefinition would completely contradict and contrary to the Founding Fathers and the ruling of the Supreme Court in the past. Interesting.
Within a 12-month period of time, in 2 more cases in 1963, the court had not only removed prayer but also Bible reading, religious classes, and religious instruction. This was a radical reversal. In June 17, 1963, the court not only reaffirmed its ban on school prayer from the previous year but further reached out and banned school Bible reading. Recall that in the brief survey already presented, the founders relied on the Bible. Early school textbooks quoted the Bible and used it as part of the alphabet, and earlier Supreme Court cases ruled that a school must teach religion and the Bible. Therefore, on what possible basis can the 1963 court justify its ruling to stop the use of the Bible in schools? The court always explains its decision in written form. The 1963 case was no different. If you go to a law library and examine the text of that decision, you will find why the Bible had to be removed from schools. In its written decision, the court noted that if portions of the New Testament were read without explanation, they could be and had been psychologically harmful to the child.